Hey guys, this is Justin at the Survivor Review, and my look at the crazy, bizarre, and strange Phantasm franchise continues today with Phantasm IV, Oblivion. Now this installment's really divisive amongst fans. Some really love it, some really hate it. I'm kind of in the middle. I'm really conflicted when it comes to this movie because it's a movie that I more appreciate than legitimately like and legitimately enjoy, because this film is the truest sequel to the original Phantasm. It really is the closest in line to the tone and feel of the first film. It really is. If I have issues with this movie, it just kind of brings it down many notches. Now, when this movie was thought of as the final film in the series for the longest time, it did feel like a fitting final chapter, because it feels like the franchise has come full circle. Because this movie is very independent and very low budget. Whereas, yeah, the third film was independent, it still had some high production value and looked like a pretty big movie for what it was. This movie is noticeably cheap. There's very minimal sets, very minimal actors, very minimal action in the film. And in its place, there's a lot of just surreal, strange stuff that happens in the movie. And also the focus of this movie is back onto Mike. Mike is now the central character of this film, and Reggie is a side character like he was in the original. So all the elements are just trying to go back to the original Phantasm. Problem is, it just doesn't make a very entertaining movie. Because the plot of this film, it picks up right after Phantasm IV, where Reggie was pinned against a wall by all the spheres, and for some reason the tall man decides to just let him go. I don't know why. And so he's on the run trying to find Mike, who ran away at the end of Phantasm III. And while that's going on, Mike is also on the road trying to just stop the tall man, figure all this stuff out. Either that or kill himself, which he just tried to do at some point in the film. He just wants to end all this stuff because it's just getting out of hand. And along the way, Reggie picks up this girl on the streets, and stuff happens with spheres, and he fights a kind of zombie police officer at one point. And Mike confronts the Jody sphere, and also we find out some of the backstory on the tall man, and find out how he became to be who he was now. And yeah, that's the gist of the plot, because the main problem with this movie is that nothing really happens in it. Granted, watching this movie again, plays a lot better than the first time I saw it. When I first saw this movie, I did not like it. I was just like, what the hell is going on? Where is the movie going to begin? And then the movie ended, and I was like, oh, that's the movie. This movie feels like the first act of a story just stretched to 90 minutes. Because most of what Mike does in the movie is wander around the desert. Yeah, there's a scene where he tries to kill himself, and there's a couple of scenes where he talks to Jody, but most of the time he's just wandering around the desert. He builds a little sphere out of a car engine. And then Reggie's whole plotline in the movie basically is he's on the run trying to find a tall man. He fights this zombie police officer who is a lot better than the zombies in Phantasm III. Those guys were stupid. This guy was actually kind of cool looking, and that was a fun sequence. That was enjoyable. But after that, he just decides to pick up this hot chick on the road, and then they stay at a motel, and then he gets attacked by the spheres, and then he decides to put on his ice cream uniform from the first movie for no real reason, but I actually like that, I don't care, and go to find Mike. That's his storyline for the entire film. So that's kind of my issue, is that nothing really happens, and it doesn't help that there's not a lot of energy in this movie. This movie lacks the charm of the first film and the energy of the second and third. This movie just feels like it's kind of just like slowly just kind of going through the story, you know? Just kind of like, yeah, it's happening. The only time it gets really interesting is when we actually explore some elements that we haven't explored in previous films. There's a whole segment where Mike actually goes back in time to the Civil War era and meets who he thinks is the tall man, but it's actually just this doctor named Jebediah Morningside who opened up the portal into the tall man's world and who would eventually go into that portal and come out the tall man. And that's what's really interesting. Angus Scrimm can play a nice, heartwarming guy like so easily that it's really jarring that when you first see him and he's just talking to Mike just like,
wouldn't you like to sit down? Let me offer you some lemonade.
And you're just like, oh, this is so weird. He's normally like intimidating and scary, but he's like legitimately nice. Like he seems like a guy I want to talk to. So his performance was great. I really liked that. And those elements were interesting. That was something unique and different than we haven't explored in previous films, and I like that. When the movie actually picks up and gets going, it is really good. Like the climax of this film is a big confrontation between the tall man, Mike, and Reggie. And even though it's not as elaborate as the previous films, there's no like big chase scene through a mausoleum. It's really just in the desert, in the middle of nowhere. It's still effective and still engaging, mostly because you like these characters. You're invested in them because you have been for the past 3 films, and those scenes really work despite it being smaller than the previous films. I liked all that stuff. And then an element to this movie that I actually think is really cool and well used is the use of flashbacks. See, when it comes to the first Phantasm film, apparently they had filmed over 3 hours of footage for it, which is insane. So they used some deleted scenes from that movie as flashbacks in this movie, which, yeah, is kind of a cost-cutting kind of way to just pad out the runtime of the movie just by showing deleted scenes from the first film. But, I don't know, I just think that's really unique. They weave them into the story pretty well. It's just really unique for a movie to have flashbacks and be able to actually use footage of actors that age, like when they were young, in the flashbacks, if you know what I mean. It's really cool just seeing unused footage from Phantasm. There's this entire sequence where they hang the tall man, and it goes on for like a few minutes, not just like a brief like minute-long clip. It's like a full sequence. And I thought that was really unique. I liked seeing that stuff, actually. The flashback they used in the final scene of the movie I thought was great and very well used. It's kind of weird how they weave in stuff from Phantasm IV into that scene to make it actually feel like a scene that was meant to be in this movie in a weird way. It's really effective, really creepy and eerie, and to be honest, makes a pretty decent send-off to the series, despite having it come full circle. So I really like that. I thought that was really well handled. I like that stuff. This movie cut down on the over-the-top humor from the previous 2 films, which also makes it more in line with the first film. The movie's still funny, still has a good sense of humor to it. It just doesn't try too hard to be funny like the third movie did. It just does its own thing, has some good jokes, and there's one amazing sequence in the movie that's very memorable with the girl that Reggie stays with. And the next morning he wakes up and he sees her chest is moving. And of course, being the horny old man that Reggie is, he decides to unbutton the shirt, and it turns out her boobs have become spheres. That's just a very memorable image from this movie, just sphere boobs. And I like that part. It's probably the most memorable sequence of the film. So as you can tell, there are stuff that I really like about the movie. It's just there's not enough for me to get really invested in the film. When that stuff does happen, when there is interesting elements like the tall man backstory and that kind of stuff, I'm invested and I'm in. This movie just feels like a lot of build-up and no real payoff. You got many moments with the tall man taunting the character, saying stuff like,
"The final game now begins."
And all these like build-up stuff, you're like, what's he's building towards? What's going to happen? And then nothing really does. There's a lot of interesting elements that like you think are going to pay off, like Mike building a sphere in the engine, and it really doesn't. He uses it once, and it attaches to the tall man. He just goes, "Oh, cool," and then he uses it to blow up a car. That's it. It's like, oh, okay, that's what we were waiting the entire movie for? And with Mike finally being in the picture as, like, the main character, you want to explore stuff like, what's up with the sphere in his head from the ending of the third film? What's going on with that? But you don't really get much of that. You don't really get much of that explored. You did get more explored with him and Jody kind of being a bad guy in this movie, actually, which I thought was really unique. And I like that element. That stuff's okay, but, like, nothing, like, is explained with Mike, and, like, why is the tall man going after Mike? Why is Mike such a big deal to the tall man? You still don't get a whole lot of that despite him finally being in the forefront of this film. So stuff like that just doesn't add up, and again, this movie has a lot of build-up, and when the movie really gets started, it's the climax of the movie. I remember watching this for the first time, and when it got to the climax, I was like, alright, things are getting good. Can't wait to see what happens next. And then it cut to credits, and I was like, oh, that's the ending. It's really strange that this was the final movie for such a long time, being as it's the only movie in the series to actually end on a cliffhanger. Every other movie ends with like a little fun horror stinger, like the tall man pops up after being defeated, like, nope, I'm still alive. But this one literally ends on an actual cliffhanger. Like, what's going to happen next? So it's weird that we had to wait almost 20 years to get an actual follow-up to that. So nothing really happens this entire movie. It's a lot of people just sitting around waiting. That's the best way to describe this movie. Just a lot of sitting around and waiting. So out of 10, I'm going to give the movie a 6.5 out of 10. Tone-wise, it's a much better movie than Phantasm III. It's much more in line with the original. It's a lot more bizarre, really out there. Overall, I am more entertained by Phantasm III than this one because this one, again, doesn't have a whole lot happening. But when it's good, it's good. It's very conflicting for me. So as I've been mentioning in the video, for the longest time, this was the final film in the Phantasm series. Until about 2 years ago, when all of a sudden they came out and said, oh, by the way, we made Phantasm V, here you go. And that was really exciting, though we still had to wait a couple years, but it's finally out, so that's what I'll be talking about next time. And until then, I'll talk to you guys later.